Good afternoon, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. And today we're reading the second half of Chapter 4, American Life in the 17th Century, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant Textbook. Joining us today, we have our guest star, Teddy.
Hi.
Teddy, would you like to start us off?
I'd love to. So today's section starts off with the New England family. Now, in contrast to families in the South, which we talked about before, where life was, as Thomas Hobbes put it, brutish, nasty, and short, life in New England was somewhat better, as there was clean water and cool temperatures. Because of this, disease was not nearly as prominent in New England as it was in the South. Now, because of this, family life was much more stable in the North than it was in the Chesapeake regions. So for this reason, children grew up in this area in a much more controlled and nurtured environment. Indeed, women usually had up to 10 children and raised up to 8 of them. And generally, their livelihood and their occupation for their entire life up until menopause was birthing and raising children. However, death in childbirth was not uncommon, and so for this reason, many women began to fear childhood. However, once they began to raise their children, then not only were parents involved, but also grandparents were, quote, invented in this area, as many generations now had the job of raising the children. However, in the South, women actually had more power than they did in the North, specifically because of the predominance of disease and because it was much a harder life in the South. Men died younger, and thus women had to have power and could inherit money in the South. However, in New England, the New England governors and leaders of the government didn't want to undermine the sanctity of marriage and thus did not give women nearly as many rights as they did men. Then jumping off of this, the section goes on to talk about how women in the North were deemed weaker than men, mainly based off of the legend of Adam and Eve from the Bible. And indeed, divorce and adultery were pretty much impossible and were severely punished, as we saw in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. So, Abe, would you like to talk about how governance was in these New England towns?
It will be my pleasure. So life in New England was pretty organized compared to the South and the Middle colonies, the South especially. New towns were legally chartered by colonial authorities, and the town fathers were given the responsibility of land distribution. A town usually had a meeting house in the center, and then it was surrounded by several different houses and a village green, and then, of course, the militia training area. Towns of more than 50 families had to provide primary education, but we still did have development of secondary education, such as in 1636, the Puritans established Harvard College in Massachusetts to train men to become ministers. Puritans ran their own churches and democracy in the congregational church government, which is basically this self-governing Puritan congregation without the hierarchy of the Anglican Church. So that led logically to democracy in political government. So very interesting, we had the first roots of democracy in the New England governments. Now, Frank, could you tell me, did the Puritan religion, did that ever manifest itself in violent ways?
Unfortunately, it did. So as Puritans began to worry about their children, which, as Teddy pointed out, they had more control over than in the South, they began to wonder whether or not they were being as loyal and as faithful. And a new type of sermon came about called the Jeremiad. In Jeremiads, earnest preachers scolded parishioners for their waning piety in the hope to improve the faith of all. However, troubled ministers announced a new formula for church membership in 1662, calling it the Halfway Covenant. And what it was, basically, was that in the Halfway Covenant, all people could come and participate in the church. They were trying to get more and more people under the church roof to have more and more authority. However, what the Halfway Covenant did, which undermined Puritanism, was that it made it so that people didn't need the visible saint status, which they needed before, and so that only the half-converted could join the church as well, meaning that it wasn't full Puritans in with the rest of the full Puritans. In the early 1690s, a group of Salem girls claimed to have been bewitched by certain older women, starting what we now know as the Salem witch trials. What followed was a hysterical witch hunt that led to the execution, the legal lynching, of 20 people in Salem. This witchcraft hysteria eventually ended in 1693, but it's a good example of how Puritan obsession with being perfect unto the Bible led to violence.
Some of you may have read The Crucible, in which they discuss the Salem witch trials, if you remember that.
So, Teddy, what factors led to the development of New England's economy?
Well, the main factor contributing to the New England economy was indeed its rocky soil. In contrast to the Chesapeake region, otherwise known as the South, New England's soil was not too suitable for agricultural development. Now, as a result of this, the large plantations and cash crops such as tobacco, cotton, and sugar that were grown in the South were not seen in New England or the North. And indeed, because of this, black slavery also did not develop. Simply put, it just wasn't necessary for these small farms to use slavery. It was just too expensive. Additionally, New England also became less ethnically diverse than its southern neighbors. Due to its unwelcoming soil and fiery sermons, many immigrants simply didn't want to come to New England as much as they wanted to come to the South. Additionally, immigrants were specifically unwelcome from New England because of its climate. Indeed, people complained that the summers were too hot and that the winters were too cold. It was an incredibly mountainous region with short, rapid rivers. Additionally, the New Englanders chastised the Indians for their misuse of the land. Now, during the time when the Native Americans occupied New England, they used the land to their full ability and didn't really abuse it as far as the New Englanders did. However, as soon as immigrants came in, they turned usage of the land into complete ownership of the land, which was a new idea for this region. And thus, with livestock and other materials used to exploit the land, they thus destroyed and changed the climate of New England, specifically in terms of livestock. Because they needed so much space and food, these livestock cleared fields and increased erosion in the region, actually worsening the climate more than it already was. Furthermore, even more than livestock, fishing was a natural part of the New England economy. Indeed, because the agriculture was so poor, New Englanders turned to fishing as a way to supply themselves with sustenance and economic welfare. Additionally, because of all of this and because of the hardiness and necessity to become sort of entrepreneurial, these New Englanders thought they were, quote, God's chosen people. And through this, as well as their Calvinism, after they were removed from New England, after they left because they got so frustrated with the rocky soil, they then spread this idea of exceptionalism, hardiness, and entrepreneurialism to all of America and really defined it as we know it today. So how were these settlers' daily life?
Yeah, so basically it was a pretty simple life. Early farmers would rise at dawn and went to bed at dusk, so they were awake during the hours when the sun was out. Few events were done during the night unless they were deemed worth the candle, which is basically worth burning the candle, worth the time. Women usually wove and cooked and cared for children, while men planted and cleared the land. Most of the people that emigrated from Europe to the Americas were usually lower middle class citizens looking to have a better future in the New World. They weren't the extremities of society's hierarchy. They weren't the aristocrats, nor were they the poorest members of society. So there was this general sameness of class in America. It was a very egalitarian society. Laws against extravagances were sometimes passed, but as time passed, America itself grew, the population grew, and diversity did develop. Thank you for watching. Please comment,
Like,
And subscribe.
catch you guys next time.